So next up for speaking here, we're going to have Patrick Lamson-Hall. Patrick is an urban planner by trade. He's at the Marron Institute at New York University. He's worked on urban planning projects all across the globe, I think mostly in Sub-Saharan Africa, is that correct? That's a fair assumption, okay. And he's going to talk about one of those African projects, so the Ethiopian Urban Expansion Initiative, where I think he was embedded with 18 secondary cities across Ethiopia, and he's going to share some learnings with us today. So Patrick, without further ado, take it away.
Great. Thanks. Very nice to be here today. Thanks, everyone. It's very strange to talk into a microphone that doesn't make your voice louder. Tell me, everyone can hear me okay? Yes. Good. So I'm just curious who's in the room. Who is in academia here? Some people half raised their hands. And of the people who are in academia, who are students? Great. And who works for an international development agency or NGO? Okay. And who's in private practice? And who's here just for the heck of it? Great, good. Michael. Great, good. I was just curious because I think this is a really excellent conference, the first one, and I'm excited to be here. The presentations so far have been really, really good, and because it's the first conference like this, I wanted to know who was attending. I am going to talk about a project that I've been working on in Ethiopia since 2013 with my team at New York University. It's called the Ethiopian Urban Expansion Initiative, and normally this slide would say the Ethiopian Urban Expansion Initiative. What I'm going to try to do in this presentation is, in addition to giving information about that work, I'm going to talk a bit about the context that led to it, and what I think, in a general and very rough way, the learnings are for the construction of new cities. So we come to this topic of new cities in a world that's facing very rapid urban population growth. We're looking at a 2.3, 2.4 billion person increase in the populations of less developed countries by 2050. And when we look at where urban population growth is occurring, we can see that based on these UN population division regions of more developed and less developed countries, urban population growth through 2050 is really a less developed country phenomenon. The banner statistic: for every one new urban resident in a more developed country, 18 new residents will be added to cities in less developed countries. So if you're an urban planner, if you want to work on urban planning is a less developed country practice at this point. It should be, if it's not. The composition of these people who are moving to cities is interesting. When countries are urbanizing, one of the things that happens is people move from rural areas to cities. And if we take Sub-Saharan Africa, which is the region that I am most familiar with, we can see that about 40% of new urban residents are rural to urban migrants. This is a considerable proportion, especially when you consider that a lot of these people don't have relationships or connections in the urban areas that they're moving to. They don't have urban job skills. They're likely to be low income. And cities need to accommodate these people. They need to create environments that will allow these people to succeed, or the project of urbanization that's going on worldwide will not succeed. I just briefly list here some of the reasons why people are moving to cities. An increasing one is climate change. This is exacerbating all of the other negative things that we see here. This is often framed as push and pull factors. It's kind of an oversimplification, but there are things that incentivize people to move to cities and things that incentivize people to stay once they get there. And as cities increase in population, they also increase in area. And that's because more population in cities not only makes cities more productive in a general sense, but it increases the demand for floor space. We have here the example of Accra, Ghana, satellite mapping of Accra between 1991 and 2014. The population increased 3.4-fold over that almost 25-year period. The area increased 6.1-fold. Now, this kind of information makes a lot of people really nervous. What I would say is we studied 200 cities over this 25-year period. We found that every city that we studied in that sample of 200 cities, every single city had expanded in area, including cities that had lost population. Cities expand in area because household sizes decline, people become wealthier, there's a desire for more housing, more transportation, more business, more government services, more parks, more of everything. And globally, we find that when cities double in population, they triple in area. Now, you can view this as a good thing, you can view this as a bad thing, it's up to you, but it does appear to be the case based on the data. When we look at more detail in how cities grow, we can realize that cities basically can add population in two ways. They can add population through infill, which is people settling in the existing areas of cities. That causes densification. Or they can add population on their peripheries in newly built areas. And again, when we look at cities around the world from 1990 to 2015, we find about 3/4 of population growth is accommodated in newly built areas of cities. So, view it as a good thing, view it as a bad thing. This is the data. So, what does that mean when we're considering planning for new cities? One thing that it means is we should start by recognizing that most new cities are not going to be true greenfield projects. They're going to be happening adjacent to existing urban areas. They're going to be either happening through extension, they're going to be happening at some short distance from existing cities. They're going to be driven by urban expansion in existing urban areas. This is basically the context in which we're thinking about new cities. And the challenge right now, at least in Sub-Saharan Africa, is that most of the efforts to plan for this urban growth, especially through creating new cities, but in general, are focused on a limited number of internationally connected megacities. There are about 54 cities with 1 million people or more in Sub-Saharan Africa, and they get a lot of the oxygen in terms of international planning attention. But the most important urban planning work probably is what's taking place or should be taking place in secondary cities. There are 414 secondary cities with 100,000 people or more in Sub-Saharan Africa, and they absorbed a little bit more than half of the total population growth over this 20-year period for which I had data. And if we look at this map, this is a map that shows population density and those secondary cities. 90% of the population in Sub-Saharan Africa lives within 100 kilometers of a secondary city. These are cities of arrival for new migrants. They're cheaper, they're better connected to the rural areas, and migrants are much more likely to have existing networks in those cities. So again, I'm saying, if you want to be a planner, if you want to do planning, if you want to work on new cities, less developed countries, secondary cities. This is really where there's a big need. And you can see it. You can see the different kinds of solutions that are being put forth for this. So between 1990 and 2015, the average city in Sub-Saharan Africa increased 3-fold in population and 4-fold in area. And when we consider the ways that new cities are being built on the urban periphery, we can see that there's a big contrast between the formal private sector concept of a new city, like this is Calamba in Angola, and the things that are being produced by the informal private sector. Like Barrio Rangel here, this offers a range of housing sizes and styles and costs. Many of them are self-built. Calamba, the cheapest unit available, costs $70,000. That's with the $50,000 subsidy. So the actual cost is $120,000. The government is subsidizing $50K because many of these units are vacant. And this is in a country with a per capita GDP of $1,900 a year. Treat it as criticism if you want. So when we think about this in terms of planning, which is my discipline, we can see that the formal private sector versus the informal private sector produce really, really, really different results on the ground. The formal private sector can create planned cities, right? Private actors can create planned cities. These cities have adequate provision of basic services, but they can't house poor residents properly. The informal private sector can create housing and floor space, and they can do it at scale and at a cost that works, but they can't do planning, and they can't provide basic services. They're not organized in a way that allows them to do that. So this creates a role for the public sector. As cities are growing rapidly in population and area, it's happening little planning for growth. When we think about how to plan their urban peripheries, and we recognize that most new growth is occurring informally, we come to the conclusion that we need proactive planning. We need proactive public sector planning. And the reason why we need that is because areas can go from being rural and informal to being urban and informal very fast. And when this has already happened, the option that city governments have to retrofit it, the options aren't very good. So this is a neighborhood in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, for example, that developed informally. And it took 11 years to redevelop this area. About 100,000 people were displaced. And they undertook this because when they assessed the complications involved in retrofitting this area, they concluded that this business of demolishing it and then building a formal neighborhood was a better option. What they should do is plan proactively. They should actually put the connectivity and the planning structures in place before development happens. And this is really what's failing to happen on the peripheries of cities in Sub-Saharan Africa. The connection between planning and services is really important. Basic services like transportation, water, power, sewage, drainage, these things need corridors or rights of ways to run if they're going to form networks. And it can be as much as 7 times more costly to put in basic services in unplanned areas. On the left, we're seeing a city in Ethiopia that opened up a road through an existing informal settlement. And on the right, we're seeing an example of a simple red dirt road that was placed in a peripheral area in advance of the occupation of land. When people have already settled in a place, it's very costly and challenging to rearrange things to make room for parks and roads and public buildings. It's much easier if you do that planning work in advance. So this brings us to the question of how we can plan new cities. If we think about it in terms of a need to create corridors, if we think about it in terms of public sector activities, we can see that urban plans basically need to specify the division between private land and public land. And the public lands that need to be identified in advance are the public lands for parks and open spaces and the public lands for streets and roads. It's not the only work that needs to be done to plan cities, let me be clear about that. There's more work that needs to be done to plan cities than just this. But if you do this work in advance, it's tremendously easier to do everything else down the road. So, I boil this into 4 things. We need the public sector to separate public land from private land through subdivision. We needed to create connections that facilitate the formation of metropolitan labor markets. These are roads. When you put those roads in, it adds value, and you can capture that value and use that to finance the provision of basic services. We need parks and public spaces to be created. And then the 4th thing, maybe some people disagree with this, I don't think that there's a lot of benefit in rapidly growing new areas in spending a lot of time on land uses, particularly in informal areas where you're unlikely to be able to implement those ideas in any case. I'll get you to raise your hands again. Who works in developing countries? We all know that developing countries have land use maps that hang on the walls in the municipality. They're often quite large and very well designed. And when you compare what's on those maps to what's on the ground in the city, you realize that the money they spent making those plans would probably have been better spent on gin. It has no impact whatsoever. And that's because they lack the regulatory frameworks to control land uses in informally developed areas. So we have to ask ourselves, Why are we using resources on that task if we're not able to actually put them in practice? I suggest that we let it slide for now, allow land and housing markets to develop organically over time, and focus those resources that could go into chasing down land users, focus those resources on mitigating actual externalities. That's something that they may well be capable of doing. I'm happy to talk about that more during the next break. It's not what this presentation's about. And I just threw up here an example of what an urban plan might look like if you don't mess around with land uses. It simply subdivides this parcel into private land, the public land and streets, roads in gray, and a limited number of public buildings. That's it. That's all it does. The reason why I think this is a good way to do it is because although many cities have plans, the plans are rarely implemented. And especially in, as I was saying, in low-income cities, this is a real waste of resources. Part of the problem is that the plans are too complex. So when planning is done well, not only should the plan be implementable, it should actually produce a visible impact on the ground. And it should do it kind of quick. You should be able to see within a few years an impact in Google Earth imagery from your plan, if you're making a plan for a new growth area. The Serdab plan is a great example because the Google Earth image from 2022 looks exactly like the plan from 1859. But this is what we should be seeing. If we were succeeding as planners in low-income countries, this is what we'd be seeing in the Google Earth imagery. We'd be able to take the plan and compare it to what we see on the map, and it would match. And maybe it changes over time. You do some evolutions. But in general, we're not seeing anything even close to this. So given all this background and the sudden realization that I'm going to run over time, what can we conclude about the basic urban planning needs for cities in the Global South? Well, they need plans that can address their rapid urban growth. This is the major challenge that these cities are facing, a rapid urban growth. Rapid urban growth is a peripheral phenomenon. It's not a core phenomenon. The reason why I say this is the major challenge is because we have to understand that rapid urban growth in cities in the Global South is a time-limited phenomenon. Urbanization will end before the end of this century. The major relocation of the population from rural areas to cities will be over before the end of this century. The next 2 generations are the generations in which cities are being built. And these are the generations where we have to tackle these core layout issues. Rapid urban growth is the thing. That means that the plans have to work at the right scale, not the kinds of plans where you spend 5 years to build 1,000 units of housing. They have to be big scale plans. They have to let markets meet the needs of the poorest residents of the cities. That means informal markets, migrants, forcibly displaced people, low-income locals. At the same time, they can't neglect the natural environment, and especially the kinds of big public green spaces that help manage water in cities, that help manage urban heat effect. And they have to be implementable. You have to be able to actually make this happen on the ground. And the only way to do that is if local political leaders can take them and run with them, because you need stakeholder collaboration in order to make these plans a reality. That means that's a process that has to be led by local political leaders. So if you do it well, they should guide investments. I use the World Bank logo because in many of the countries that I work in, the World Bank is the main entity funding investments in urban areas. It should facilitate the metropolitan labor market by creating a connectivity grid. It should ensure an adequate supply of land so that low-income residents can actually afford to access land and housing, protect important features of the natural environment, and it should make it cheaper and easier to supply basic services by creating corridors so that land acquisition and supplying basic services is less of an issue. This is what you should get if you do urban planning well in these contexts for an initial plan. So we did a study, NYU is a university. We did a study and we came up with this simple plan called the Basic Urban Expansion Plan. And the Basic Urban Expansion Plan is what we deployed in Ethiopia, working with 18 cities. It aims to meet those needs that we identified, the core urban planning needs that we see in the Global South. The methodology here is a 30-year methodology. This is to create a 30-year plan specifically on the peripheries of cities. And it's got 5 steps. The first step is to provide some basic data to let the city leaders anticipate how much growth they're likely to face. Next, to identify where that growth is likely to go. That's a political exercise. Then to ensure that there's actually some jurisdiction over that, so you don't have jurisdictional fragmentation. Then identify these environmentally sensitive areas where growth shouldn't occur. Given that, plan a network of arterial roads, 25 to 30 meters wide, spaced 1 kilometer apart on the urban periphery of the city. And these roads are designed to carry trunk infrastructure. They can be used for whatever transportation modes are in vogue at the time. When they planned the road networks in New York City in 1811, they hadn't even invented the bicycle. Those same road corridors were very convenient when they were building the subways. It's mode agnostic. That's important to consider. It simply acknowledges the fact that humans require space to move. Even if people are walking, they need some space. I know what your presentation's about. I see you smirking. And then, beyond simply making the plan, protect these road rights-of-ways. Protect the corridors. Protect the green spaces, and do it now. Acquire the land for it in the first 5 years of the plan, so you're not relying on public officials in the future to make it happen. The implementation modality is really locally led. We never touch a pencil when we do this. The cities form teams. They get some initial training. The local political leader, either a mayor, a deputy mayor, a city manager, is in charge of it because the political leaders have to know about the plan in order to be able to support it. The politician leads the team through the whole process, and it makes them able to communicate the plan to government and stakeholders in their area. Our consulting team provides training and support. The NYU team, we've provided, for instance, the city called Mekelle, we provided them with classified satellite imagery of the growth of their city from 1984 to 2010. And then we trained them to make the thing on the right, which is a very rough estimation of how much land the city is likely to consume in the future, given different assumptions about land consumption. So we taught them that math. The reason why we taught them the math is because if you know the math, then you trust the numbers. And if you have confidence in the numbers, then you can repeat them confidently when you're asking for budget allocations, when you're trying to get people on the periphery to support your work. The plans are fairly minimal. Once they know how much work is likely to occur, then they create a grid like these grids. These are all real examples of grids that cities have made and tried to do in the expansion areas of their cities. You can see that these are not complicated to plan. It usually takes a 2-day workshop to make the plan. That's very different from most plans. It takes 2 days to make the plan. It takes about 6 months to start implementing it. So implementation is where we spend most of our time, not on planning. And it's because when you're taking this first step in planning, it doesn't need to be complex. It can be pretty simple. Now, the idea isn't to build these roads today. The idea is just to secure the land for these road corridors. Then you can use the corridors as you need over time in response to demand. It creates a kind of a reserve and an orderly framework or structure for growth. In total, it amounts to about 6% of the land in the expansion area. That's what's needed for the grid. And it's pretty cheap to do this because they don't really need consultants. I think we did 6 visits over 2 years, and the rest of the work was done by the city teams that were constituted. Because it's led by local political leaders, the acquisition cost of the land is lower. Like, they're working directly with the people on the ground. They can modify the plan in ways that makes it cheaper. And these other things I mentioned, it supports basic services and land value capture. So the city leaders like that as well because it ties in with their existing agendas. Now, the short-term actions can start to reduce the long-term impact. Unfortunately, this is in the war-torn Tigray region, but we did a follow-up with them in 2018, 5 years after we initially visited. And this is their phase 1, right? This is kind of the first phase of their plan, which they're meant to build out over the first 5 years. And by God, they're building it. Even though we haven't been there in years, even though we only visited a couple of times, even though it's a simple plan, and we didn't pay for them to build it. All we did was walk them through the planning exercise. So this is an example of a successful implementation of a plan of a kind that, not to toot my own horn, but is rarely seen in Sub-Saharan Africa, where a team of consultants comes in, helps with the planning exercise, and a few years later, it actually results in something. Most of the money is wasted that goes into supporting planning exercises. It doesn't lead to new neighborhoods where people can live. So yes, I toot my own horn a little bit. I apologize. We did this in 18 cities. We tracked 4 of them. And in the 4 cities that we tracked, we had great reports from the city leaders. As you would imagine, when you create a framework for growth, it reduces squatting and informality, because then people can actually obtain affordable land within a framework that's formal. And it raises revenue, because you can tax those people. 570 kilometers constructed or protected as of 2019 in those 4 cities. And we conducted household surveys in one of the cities in the planned area and unplanned area. And we found, comparing planned and unplanned areas, people living in the planned areas were 4 times more likely to have land tenure, 4 times more likely to have piped water, 7 times more likely to have metered electricity. And it was faster and cheaper for them to get to the city center, even holding constant their distance from the city center. So this delivered things that people considered beneficial in their lives. As far as what we spent, NYU spent $500,000 to do capacity building in those 4 cities. The leaders in those cities used the land some of it, to develop local industrial parks. Not export-oriented, just local small industries that needed land for expansion. This is from 2017, but as of 2017, they had 26,000 jobs in those parks. And also residences were created, 140,000 new residences. The cities invested $10 million, about $10 million each, say, to build out the infrastructure in their first phase. And it stimulated $77 million in private investment, according to them. So this is what you could call a good value for money. So I don't want to go on too much more. I think it works partly because it's evidence-based. This is a team drawing their plan. Again, it's a 2-day workshop to draw the plan. You do a couple trainings, draw the plan, do some follow-up. Not so complicated. I think it works well because it's minimal and realistic, which means it can be locally led, which means it can adapt to different circumstances. It can be adaptive planning and be embedded in the local political reality. I think it also works well because it addresses a problem that city governments know they have in a way that they can actually afford. Like, nothing about this requires them to make capital expenditures beyond what they can afford, unlike some plans that say have a lot of good ideas but are just really, really expensive. Our role, as international partners in this case, is really limited. So in Ethiopia, like I said, 6 visits over 2 years, 2, maybe 3 workshops, and the whole approach to that technical assistance was about knowledge exchange, encouraging adaptation and improvisation by the local actors, creating an enabling environment for the work to take place. Although we only made 6 visits to the cities, I probably made a dozen visits to the ministry to make sure that they actually had permission to do this, to make sure that the people who were in charge of the city officials were aware that this was going on and supported it. That's something that international partners can do that is very hard for lower level officials to do, which is to explain something to the people who are their bosses. Institutionalization included setting up a training course at the Civil Service University. So now there's a pipeline of people who are trained in this methodology, and then setting up opportunities for peer-to-peer learning, because we really wanted to create a sense of expertise in the people we were working with. So I started this presentation by talking about rapid urban growth and its implications for spatial planning of new cities. Most urban growth is being accommodated through urban expansion, and new cities are often built on the peripheries of existing cities. The formal private sector can do some of this, but at least in countries that are developing, most of it's going to happen through the informal private sector. And that requires some facilitation by the public sector, simple facilitation. So, we developed this approach in response to that need. and worked to implement it. And what we learned in Ethiopia was that the rapidly growing secondary cities we were working with actually are capable of making simple, proactive plans, that political leaders can be engaged in this process, and we can make results happen on the ground in a relatively short amount of time. At least in developing countries, I think this approach can help the public sector take a leading role in the building of the urban periphery. And what this will do is it'll facilitate the formation of labor, land, and housing markets with major benefits for the residents who otherwise might be left behind if a big emphasis is placed on just on formal private sector approaches. So this really works well for new urban migrants, forcibly displaced people, and low-income locals. So thanks for your time. I'm sorry, I know I went over.